I became a doctor to save lives, to heal, to comfort, to make a difference. But there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that don't belong in science, in medicine, in anything we understand. What I witnessed that day, it wasn't just a medical anomaly. It was a nightmare, and it's still out there. This is the story of a patient who came to us with no hope, a hospital that became a battleground, and a creature that should never exist. If you're hearing this, know that what I'm about to tell you is real. And if you ever hear a gurgling sound, or see something move where it shouldn't, run. Just run. His name was Daniel Harper, 40 years old, a school teacher, a father of 2. By all accounts, he had been a healthy, active man until 6 months ago when everything changed. It started with stomach pain. At first, just dull aches that came and went. Then sharper, lasting longer. Then came the weight loss. His wife told us later that he lost 30 pounds in 2 months. His muscles weakened. His skin paled. He started tripping over his own feet, struggling to climb stairs. They ran tests, dozens of them, blood work, CT scans, MRIs, but nothing explained why he was dying. By the time he was admitted to our hospital, he was a ghost of himself. Gaunt, pale, barely able to speak. We needed answers, and that meant we had to open him up. The operating room was silent, too silent, even with the steady beeping of the monitors, even with the hum of machines. There was a weight in the air, something thick, something heavy, something wrong. I remember glancing at the surgical team, and for the first time in my career, I saw something I had never seen before. Fear. They wouldn't say it, but I saw it in their tight grips on their instruments, in the way they held their breath when I made the first incision. We were all thinking the same thing. What the hell are we going to find? The moment the scalpel pierced his skin, something felt off. His flesh was too loose, his muscle tissue too soft. Like his body had already started to break down, even though he was still alive. And then, we saw it. At first it looked like a growth. A strange, spindly structure, thin and black, jutting out from his stomach. It twitched. I told myself it was just his body shifting, just a reflex. But then it moved again. Not randomly, purposefully. I reached for the tweezers, my hands steady, but my mind screaming. This isn't possible. The moment I touched it, something oozed out. Thick, gray, rotten. A smell hit us. A stench so foul, so unnatural, that one of the nurses stumbled back, gagging into her mask. I could barely breathe through it. It was alive. The operating room was silent. Not just the usual focused kind of silent. A thicker silence. A waiting silence. We all stared at the thing inside Daniel's body. It wasn't just a growth. It wasn't a tumor. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist. The thin black structure protruding from his stomach twitched again, curling slightly, as if reacting to the air around it. And then, it jerked, violently, like it was trying to move away from us. One of the nurses gasped, stepping back so quickly that she knocked over a tray of instruments. The metal clattered to the floor, the sharp sound slicing through the thick tension. I clenched the tweezers tighter. Focus. I had seen rare diseases, malformed growths, parasitic infections, but this wasn't any of those things. I carefully grasped the structure, pulling it slightly to get a better look, and that's when the ooze came out. It wasn't like normal bodily fluids. It wasn't blood or pus or anything that should come from a living human being. It was thick, grayish-green. And the smell, oh God, the smell. I had encountered rot before. Decomposing tissue, gangrene, but this was worse. It was wet and metallic, with an underlying scent of something old, something ancient. One of the assisting doctors, Dr. Patel, gagged and turned away. She whispered, her voice muffled behind her mask. I kept going. I had to. I carefully lifted the strange structure, trying to see where it was rooted. But as I pulled, the entire thing shifted inside him, like it was reacting to me. I froze. The surgical team froze, and then Daniel moved. Not a reflex, not muscle spasms. He arched his back, his body stiff and unnatural, his head natural, his head snapping upward as if something had just yanked him from inside. His eyes shot open. His pupils were gone, just milky white orbs rolling wildly in their sockets. And then, he screamed, but not like a human. His throat produced a wet, gurgling sound. his lips trembling as the grayish slime bubbled up from inside him. It poured out. From his mouth, from his nose, from the incision we had made. And then I saw it, something moving beneath his skin, slow, rippling, as if something inside him was waking up, and it was hungry. Daniel was awake, but he shouldn't be. Not during surgery. Not after the anesthesia, the sedation, the medication that should have kept him under. But he was. And his body was moving in ways that weren't human. His fingers curled against the table, his chest convulsing. The bulging mass beneath his skin, writhing like something alive was crawling its way out. The gray slime kept oozing, pooling beneath him, coating the table, dripping onto the floor with thick, wet splats. And then, he stopped screaming. His body went still. His mouth hung open, strands of the slimy substance stretching between his lips. And then his head turned. Not slowly, not naturally. It jerked to the side with a sickening cracking sound, like his spine had just snapped in two. His empty white eyes fixed on me, and he smiled. Not a smile of relief, not a smile of pain, a smile of recognition. Like he knew something I didn't, like he was waiting for me to understand. And then, the lights flickered. Dr. Patel stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of instruments. One of the nurses, Samantha, gasped, "Doctor, what is happening to him?" I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. Because I saw it. I saw it moving inside him. The bulge in his stomach shifted, rippling under his skin, pressing outward, pushing against his ribs. Something long, something thin, something with legs. I took a step back, then another. The overhead surgical lights flickered again, dimming for just a fraction of a second. And then, the bulge in his stomach tore open. It burst like rotten fruit, splitting in a jagged, wet rip, spraying the room in thick, foul-smelling gore. And something crawled out, something thin and black, like an insect's leg coated in a shiny, mucus-like substance. Then another, and another, until there were dozens. Dr. Patel screamed. One of the nurses collapsed, her body hitting the floor as she retched, gagging from the stench. I couldn't move. Because Daniel, what was left of him, was still alive. His eyes twitched. His jaw trembled. He was still conscious as the thing crawled out of him. And the worst part? He was laughing. Daniel's body was ruined. His torso was torn open, a gaping, wet cavity of shredded muscle, jagged bone, and thick gray mucus. But he was still alive. His mouth hung open, his throat gurgling with the same vile fluid that oozed from his wounds. His milky white eyes rolled wildly in their sockets, his fingers twitching like a broken marionette. And the thing that had crawled out of him, it was still moving. The creature, if you could even call it that, was thin and spindly, its limbs long and insect-like, but covered in tumorous growths that pulsed like living cysts. It had legs, but they didn't move like a normal insect's. They jerked unnaturally, skittering in bursts, its limbs twitching in directions that shouldn't be possible, and its body. It was coated in teeth, not just on its mouth, if that hole could even be called a mouth, but all over. Clusters of tiny, malformed teeth jutted out of the tumors, out of the wrinkled folds of its flesh, grinding together even though they weren't attached to anything. Dr. Patel was hyperventilating. The nurses were backing away, one of them whispering a prayer under her breath, and I just stood there, staring at the thing that had come out of my patient. The thing that wasn't done yet, because Daniel's body, or what was left of it, suddenly lurched forward. His head snapped toward me, his broken, half-destroyed chest rising and falling with wet, sucking gasps. His mouth twisted, and then he spoke. Except it wasn't his voice anymore. It was low, choked, and wrong, like multiple voices speaking at once layered over each other, overlapping in a way that made my skin crawl. It took me a second to realize what he was saying. It hurts. His broken fingers clawed at the air, his body spasming, his face stretching into something that was trying to be a smile, but was just wrong. It hurts. The creature on the table twitched, its many legs scraping against the metal, as if responding to his words. The grinding teeth along its body shuddered, like they were chewing on nothing. And then Daniel said something else, something that made my blood turn to ice, something I will never ever forget. It's still hungry. And then, the lights went out. The lights went out. For a moment, there was only darkness. The room was still alive with sound, ragged breathing, the sharp clatter of something falling, the distant beep of monitors flickering before they died completely. And beneath it all, the sound of skittering legs. I reached for something, anything, in the pitch black. My fingers found the edge of the operating table, slick with something warm. The smell of iron and rot was overwhelming now, thick enough to make my throat burn. Then, a noise, a wet gurgling cough. Daniel. He was still moving, still alive. And then I heard his voice again, soft this time, like something whispered in the dark. Run! The emergency backup power kicked in, flooding the room with flickering red light. And that's when I saw it. Not just one of them. 3! The first crawled along the ceiling, its grotesque, limb-covered body writhing like a sick parody of a centipede. Its teeth, its many teeth, chattered together in eager anticipation. The second had grown from Daniel's corpse, rooted inside him like a grotesque umbilical cord. It was still connected, still pulsing, still feeding its slick, tumor-covered form shuddering with every weak heartbeat he had left. The third was standing in the doorway, waiting, watching, blocking our only way out. Dr. Patel whispered, gripping my sleeve so tightly that her nails dug into my skin. I turned to her, but she wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the walls, at the shadows that had begun to move, because we weren't alone in here, and we never were. The walls twitched. The shadows moved, stretching, crawling like they were alive. And then, a scream. Not from Daniel. Not from me, but from somewhere deep inside the hospital. A scream that was cut short, choked off by something wet and thick, like someone being dragged underwater. And then the alarms began blaring. I acted on pure instinct. We need to go, now! Dr. Patel didn't argue. She grabbed one of the surgical scalpels. Her hands trembling, and we moved together, keeping our eyes on the creatures blocking the door. They weren't attacking yet. They were waiting, studying us, like they knew something we didn't. And then the one on the ceiling dropped down. The red emergency lights flickered, casting its grotesque, limb-covered form in and out of shadow as it lunged. I barely had time to react before Dr. Patel shoved me aside, the thing missing me by inches, its slick legs skittering against the tile. The sound it made, a wet, unnatural clicking noise, was something I will never forget. The nurses screamed. The creature blocking the door twitched, then charged. There was no time to think, no time to plan, just run. We burst into the hallway, sprinting past rooms where patients were moaning, screaming, some gurgling on thick gray slime. Others weren't human anymore. They were changing, their bodies bulging, their skin splitting open as the same writhing tumors pushed out from beneath their flesh. One of them, a woman in a hospital gown, turned toward me, or at least what was left of her did. Her mouth split open too wide, stretching across her cheeks, revealing rows of jagged teeth that weren't supposed to be there. Her eyes melted, running down her cheeks like wax, and in their place, more mouths. And she laughed. A horrible, wet, gurgling sound, like something that had forgotten how to be human. The hospital was a war zone, patients convulsing in their beds, their veins turning black, their limbs sprouting unnatural growths, doctors and nurses running, screaming, some collapsing as their own bodies betrayed them. Something crawled across the ceiling, moving fast, its bulbous, tumorous body dripping mucus as it dropped onto a nurse, who didn't even have time to scream before it burrowed into her chest cavity. Rapey, the sound of flesh tearing, and then a newborn cry, not from a baby, from the thing crawling. I grabbed Dr. Patel's hand and kept running. We rounded a corner and froze. The walls were covered in something living, a thick pulsing membrane stretching from floor to ceiling. And inside it, people, trapped, suspended in the ooze, their bodies twitching, their mouths opening and closing silently, like they were trying to scream but couldn't, their stomachs bulging, growing, twisting, the things inside them moving, waiting, multiplying. I turned to Patel, my voice barely above a whisper. This isn't an infection. It's a takeover. And then the walls began to tear open. The creatures were hatching. One after another, they spilled out, their legs unfolding, their bodies twitching, their needle-filled mouths opening and closing, searching for something new to feed on. I yanked Patel backward. barely avoiding the grasping limbs of something that had just been born. We had to get out. We had to. And then I heard it. The sound I had been dreading. The sound I knew would come. A gurgle. I turned and saw Dr. Patel staggering, clutching her stomach. Her fingers trembling, her veins turning black. And when she looked at me, her eyes were already gone. "It's inside me," she whispered. And then she collapsed. I don't know how I made it out of that hospital. I don't remember running through the halls. Don't remember the screams. Don't remember the moment I realized I was the only one left. All I remember is the gurgling, the wet, unnatural laughter echoing behind me, and the smell, that thick, metallic, wrong smell. By the time the military arrived, it was too late. The hospital had been sealed off. The entire building burned to the ground, but I know the truth. I know that fire doesn't kill what was inside that place, because I've seen it. I've seen what it becomes. And I know deep in my bones that it's not over, because sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear Dr. Patel's voice. I can still hear her whispering, even though I watched her die, even though I buried her myself. I can still hear her say, "It's inside me." And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear a gurgle, and I know it's inside me too.